In this video, we're going to be talking about a solution to the taxation problem. But before we get to that, I want to ask people if they would be willing to donate to my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/challengehistory. And levels start at $1. There's a level up for $10 and then $25. Those levels will give you more and more priority for just suggesting topics at this current time. At a later time, we will be adding in, once we get more and more people, those will have their own benefits, but those will be lower benefits than we will talk about these levels when these levels get their initial, upper levels get their initial people for their threshold. But when we and those are the $50 levels and $100 levels, those will have the most priority in suggesting topics. And the $50 level will, when it hits its threshold for enough people, there will be a giveaway for a Roman Empire silver coin, and that will be initially yearly with it. And as we add more people, we'll do it more frequently. $100 level will be a Byzantine era gold coin, and it will be under the same idea. Once we get enough people, it'll at least need to be a little like 5 or 6 people on each of those two levels for those giveaways to start, and that's when we will do those. And it will engage those things. Now, first of all, is what we need to discuss first is the point that we know that we do not have a revenue problem. The problem is actually that we have a spending problem. We've discussed this previously, and that is the problem with the whole budget. And it shows because we keep seeing departments go over budget, and they spend more than we end up spending more than we're bringing in, despite bringing in record levels of revenue. Now, what this is to discuss is what solution is best for a liberty-minded solution for the people. What is actually the fair solution? Now, in taxation, you have your traditional percentage systems. That is one way with it. We'll talk about that in a second. You have what would be a consumption tax. That is another system. And then you would have another system would be to use only business tax and have that essentially trickle down. That would be another solution. And your last, and then deal with no income tax and have it only being paid by businesses itself, and have them have businesses deal with all whatever revenue it needs for the actual country. And then your last one would be through tariffs, and have tariffs supply the revenue needed for the country. First off is where you can actually see that we're currently using a tariff system, and you can see that it's developing about 57 billion, which would be far short of what would be needed. Corporate tax revenue would essentially have to go up as well with it if we were to do that. As well, if we were to do anything, we would have to drop the idea of a payroll tax. That would have to be put onto the idea of a corporate tax or business tax to ensure that we were actually developing any type of a revenue. We could see that basically about basically the revenue that is being brought in is kind of being split, majority of it from an income tax and kind of being very, very closely divided between income tax and payroll tax. So if that were not much is being brought in from the corporate tax revenue. So what would have to happen is there would have to be a way to adjust this if you were to keep the same levels of revenue. And there's a few, and we know that if we look at the amount of tariffs right here, as we're seeing in the debt clock, we can see that that would not suffice. The payroll tax revenue is being paid by the worker currently, and frankly, that's putting such a burden on the worker that we could actually see that that is not a fair system. This has been talked about eliminating, but if we eliminate this, you could see that that would eliminate the federal tax revenue, which is about just shy of 3.4 trillion right now. That would knock it down to about 2.1 trillion. So if you look at that revenue, you would actually see that that would actually severely reduce. Now, income tax is another one that if we were to essentially pull that out and not have individuals pay that, that would actually almost completely eliminate the federal tax revenue base. Now that this is the whole thing we would need to understand. Now what would have to happen is, if you look at what we're doing, is that you could see with what's happening with the debt is it's still climbing at rapid rates. Now to actually get something reasonable, we need to cut a massive amount of spending. Now when we get to our solutions, now if we do tariffs, it's going to have to it would have to be anything that comes in. Now this would essentially eliminate any type of trade deal that we're currently in. The World Trade Organization we would have to exit from, because of we would have to have trade restrictions on every country that sends goods to the United States. And this would be the only way that we could do it. And it wouldn't necessarily mean a very, very high value of tariffs. It would just mean a certain number of tariffs being put in. And that would be the solution. Well, the problem being is you might see countries actually imposing tariffs on our goods, which essentially would cause problems for us in the long run. Now, we would have to almost scratch that. Now, when we go to the idea of the different percentage-based options, for that we'd have to go out here, and first we need to understand is what our actual average income is. Now, our average income is about $60,200 per person for a 4-person family, because that's about what we average. We actually average about 1.88 children per female, which is approximately 2 per female, which would equal out a 4-person family. That would we're not going to fraction it out. We're going to make it out as an actual full person. So what that means is that the average family is pulling about $240,800. Where does that put them in the actual bracket? As you'll see, this is the married filing jointly. It puts them right in that center bracket between the $165,001 and $315,000. This is your average family, and that means they're putting roughly a quarter of their revenue into the government. Now, if we think about it, is they put all their hard work during the year, and essentially roughly about 3 months of that work directly goes to the government for them to have. Regardless of what you think of anything with it, you should not think that the government is deserving of that money at all, because the government didn't do anything for it. In many cases, the government shows no function for the actual people, because the people in many cases don't support what our military is doing overseas. They a lot of times are non-interventionist. They don't support what the military is doing. They would rather see the military just stay home and actually only defend if we're being attacked here at home. And you will see when it comes to policies on everything, you'll see that they disagree with a lot of the things that the government's spending money on, and they feel that it could be spent such as the Department of Education. They feel that education should be better spent locally, and they feel that the states and local communities can do the job better, and that a lot of this money is just being pulled out and wasted. And that when we see welfare, they feel that local charities could do a much better job than the actual government stealing their money, wasting it in a bureaucracy, and shipping a little bit of it back out to these people that require help. And when it comes down to it, is you're essentially taking 3 months of their pay just to basically do this, and this is why they disagree with what's actually going on. So this is what ends up going on, and that would be essentially what you're doing. The average person out there in America is essentially paying, this is Mr. Average, is paying 3 months of their pay. And for those people, you go, oh, but what about the poor person that's working? The minimum they're going to have is basically 10%. That means if they work 2,080 hours, 208 of their hours is going to pay for the government. Mind you that when we also talked about this, a lot of that was going. This is just income tax, mind you. And when we talk about also is we also have payroll tax revenue. Now they're also in this whole mix. Is we need to also talk about payroll tax. These people are also paying for payroll tax on top of that. That's Medicare. That's to pay for Medicare and Medicaid. Maybe they don't want it. Maybe they feel that they can handle that better on their own. They don't want to pay for it. And this is the whole point. This takes another 15% out of their paycheck for the average person, and that means. In addition, that means this person adds 10%. They could be losing up to 25% of their check just because of not only the income tax but also payroll tax. Now, payroll tax does kind of, it doesn't always impact the 15%, but on the average it takes 15%. Sometimes they'll downgrade it a little bit, but it still does take a good chunk of your change. Now, in the end, with it, usually a lot of this 10% gets refunded, but you're still paying all of that money for this payroll tax. And that payroll tax is at least minimum 10% of your money, even if you're not paying the full 15% at this rate. So you're still at least paying that amount of money, even if you're getting this amount of money right there, the 10% refunded for your write-offs. But as you start to go up, you're not going to get that money for the average person. You're not going to get that money written off, and you're going to lose all of that, and your tax revenue starts to go up. This is with both income tax, and you're going to be paying the payroll tax. You're paying a lot of it, and that means you're going to be spending a lot of money. So when people say, oh, but most people don't pay income tax, and that's true. Most people don't pay income tax, but the problem being is every working person pays payroll tax, and payroll tax can be just as troublesome. And when you start to add the two together, especially during those paychecks, you're still pulling out money for that income tax in those payroll checks, and that's the problem. Is that pulls money out of your pocket, and that's a serious problem for people. And when we see this, that should be dealt with. Now, it doesn't matter if we're talking this flat rate, if we want to keep everything the same, I mean, we can deal with this flat rate, which is 24%, and I don't think that people earning just barely above $19,000 can afford 24%. We can go with a regressive tax, which means the people earning the least amount would pay this 37% on top of the payroll tax. And then it would go down to basically being 10% being the lowest rate for the people making the most. Now that's not going to pass, obviously. It would basically give businesses the most benefits so you can get the cheapest products in the store, but it really wouldn't change any type of factor. Then you get the current progressive system, which basically means that products become the most expensive, but you get to keep the most money in your the poorest people get to keep the most money in their wallet because they're paying the lowest rates. And so we know that both the regressive and progressive systems, as well as the flat tax systems, are actually flawed because it's based on you're trying to overtax. And to reduce these amounts means you have to reduce spending by a massive degree. Now, if we reduce spending by cutting it essentially in half, you could essentially do a good amount, and the rates wouldn't be as punishing if you were to do any of those three systems. But still, you would see, even at a flat rate, it would still be 12%. And if you were to flip it for a regressive, it would still be about 17.5% for the poorest people and 5% for the richest, or vice versa, as well. Which is still, it would give a little bit of a boost, but not as much as you could. Now, the other option would be basically starting to strip even more out of the government, and realizing that you could probably get the most out of doing it through a voluntary system of a very, very small consumption tax. And that's what we need to realize is probably the best option is that, because other options that have been suggested is a la carte, but the problem being is a la carte, you're not going to have many people that are willing to spend money on the military if the military refuses to change its role. The military refuses to change its role, it's not going to get a penny, and you're basically going to be adding on loans, and they're basically going to go back to square one with forcing you to pay for these things. And they're probably going to, what they'll do is they'll put a lot of their actions in other bills to pay for the loans, and they'll probably have, and that'll be the solution for them. And that's going to be what they're going to do. Now instead, we can actually go with the better option, which I like a la carte, but we know what's going to be the end result, because we know that the military is not going to be honest with what they're going to do. So to get a better system, you would need to go with something that's going to be cutting down spending a great deal, and it's going to have to be across the board, and it's going to have to cut down that, and it's going to essentially have to force changes, essentially, but not necessarily cause people to allow them to fully put the money where they want it, because we know that we're not going to get funding like they actually want. The funding rate currently at the rates that they're looking for are never going to happen. They're not going to get $750 billion for the Department of Defense on a voluntary system. That would never happen in a million years. Even 2/3 of that would be very, very surprising. The most they would ever get would probably be 1/3 of that, and that would be and that would be essentially forcing them out of NATO, forcing them out of any entangling alliances, and making them only work on defending the United States and its territories alone, which would essentially cause us to have to shut down all foreign bases and bring them domestically. So what would so that would be the option with it, but the fact is then you would have you would have certain people that would donate into it, but not enough with it, and it wouldn't necessarily come at a very fast rate, because even though you would have military contractors that want money to go into it, they want to get money out of it, and they don't want to put their money into it because they're looking for a profit. They're not looking for actual actions from it. They want to sell stuff. They don't want to pump their money into it, and that's the whole thing. Just looking at that alone, and when we're looking at other things with it, there's the people that are getting money out of it. They don't want to pump their money into it to keep these things alive. They want to basically just get money out. And that leaves us with our last option, which would be just a consumption tax. Now, consumption tax would be the most realistic option, and this would essentially keep it so that everybody puts that anytime someone purchases something, it would allow them to fund the government. Now, your option would be basically, if you didn't want to fund the government, you would purchase less during that month, and less non-essential items during that month, and you could do that. And you could do that and send a message to the government if you didn't like what they were doing. And this could essentially cause them to change what they're doing, and it would force them onto some certain changes. Now, other things that could also change the system would be if you were to end the central banking and force it onto gold currency. Now, gold currency means that you can't just all of a sudden establish fake money and start printing out money, and it would force them to have to deal with actual coined money, as the Constitution states. This would essentially create a real hard point for them to establish loans for themselves beyond what they would actually have in value, and they could not. They would have to show reasonable ability to pay them back, and it would have to be no different than any other person putting up collateral to basically pay them back, and that would be the whole point. And if you look at previously when we actually had this standard, you would see that the loans did not stay outstanding for that long. And it was basically because we stayed with a policy that did this. Now, what would this mean for the average person? The average person wouldn't have to spend out money when it comes down to taxation. There would be no need for the IRS. We would just be basically automatically. It would be an automatic send-in for your money. The purpose of some of these programs would go away, and you would have a lot of the departments start to disappear. The idea of corporate aid, foreign aid, and domestic and all your public aid would go away as well, because it would be seen as not a function of government anymore, because it would not be seen as useful. The function of the military would now be seen as defense, because it would need to conserve funds to keep that number of the taxation coming in, to ensure that that if people do cut down in their funds they're giving the government by saying they're not going to spend as much money, that they will not do any by not doing any shopping, that they will not that it will not impact the government a great deal, and this will essentially lead the changes to being positive for everyone. Now, when people go, oh, but the poor aren't going to have their welfare and their food stamps and all this stuff. Well, what's going to happen is charities are going to take over, and what will happen is that in the end, you're going to see massive deflation in the prices, because you're not going to see Keynesian system survive, and people are going to laugh off the modern monetary theory. Because it's a complete and utter joke. Because it looks like something that Bubba J from Jeff Dunham came up with. And we'll actually go with something legitimate like the Austrian theory for money, where people actually understand that the value of money is going to be declared by the actual market itself, not by some person in an ivory tower that basically says, well, I think it's worth this, I think. And that's basically what we have, what the Keynesian system does. Now, what modern monetary theory does is they kind of use that, and they kind of make it even worse by saying, well, I don't believe in ideas such as the actual market, and I don't believe in the ideas such as inflation. Well, you don't have to believe in them. They exist. And what they're doing is they're throwing out any bit of logic that the Keynesian system had left, and they're basically throwing that on the fire. So it's basically nothing but unicorn economics. And that's why you can't go with that. Now, with this thing with it, you need to understand that we need to go away from this massive spending, and people think, oh, it's just spending on the left. No, it's not. There's plenty of spending on the right for a lot of things. You're finding farm subsidies. They love their farm subsidies. You're finding military spending. Love military spending. They love giving away to certain countries that they like. They love giving money away to Israel. They love giving away money to NATO and other countries as well. They think that they can buy friendship. And when it comes down to all these different programs like that, instead of actually just realizing that you can cut a lot of fat out, there's so much fat there with it that it can be that minimum half of it can be cut out, and it's very, very easy. And when it comes to regulations, you don't need all these regulations on the books. With it, they can start just gutting them as we speak. And we don't need like the war on drugs. With it, we can end it right now. The fact is that's one of the things right now. It's very, very costly, number one. Number two is it's not even constitutional. It was based on a UN decree, a UN agenda actually, that we basically passed a law, and it was never actually checked by the Judicial Department, Supreme Court, as actually being constitutional. If you look at the actual history, you realize that you need a constitutional amendment to ban any substance. That means it's not constitutional. And anybody who understands that realizes that. Now, this is essentially something that's wasted in a direct monetary way over $1 trillion. Now, if you start to add in other factors, it's probably wasted even more, because you took people out of work and there was a lot of other money that could have been made. Hell, if you've actually tried to grab revenue money from this, if you actually took it from the idea of a consumption tax from that point, you could have actually made so much money on it that you've probably wasted near $10 to $15 trillion. if not more, because of all of the transactions that have actually gone through, and of all the people that you've thrown in jail, and of all this money wasted on all these other actions and spending on all these other wars that have basically been really more side projects on the war on drugs merely. And that's really what they've been on. You got to understand is much of what we did in Afghanistan was really this continuation beyond us looking for Bin Laden, realizing he wasn't there. The reason why we've continued there is because we said we want a war on drugs. Well, we realized that we're not actually doing anything there because we don't want to anger the drug lords there. Well, then why are we there to begin with? And it's because we want to continue this deliberate failed war on drugs. And this war on drugs is more about shipping drugs in than anything else. If we've actually wanted to be successful, we would spray Roundup on the plants and kill them. And that would be a way to actually eliminate it, and that would actually shut down a whole season's worth of heroin and whatever types of drugs that they want to ship in off this. And this would essentially shut down massive amounts, and it would be done for probably just a few $1,000s. Less than $10,000, we could probably pretty much end the output of heroin probably globally, at least for a short period of time, until they want to regrow it. And that would be essentially something that we would do. And that's what we need to start to realize, and that's something that's very, very important. And that's why when we go about cutting money as well, and with this tax solution, that's a very big part, because we don't need to be spending all this money, number one, and number two, and we need to be looking constitutionally, and number two, we need to look at what's actually fair for people, because we don't want people to start spending a lot of their money on a government that's completely useless. Look at the TSA, for instance. We keep putting more money into it, and the best they can hope for is 80% failure rate. Doesn't seem like they actually are working. Now, if you put that over to being private and let the actual airlines take care of it, they have a vested interest in actually doing the job right. And I can guarantee you they would have a minimum of an 80% success rate in finding bombs. That would be a minimum. Probably well over a 95% success rate in finding bombs, which would be basically the highest failure rate that's that the TSA has ever had. That would be the actual success rate of these new security workers for these airline companies. And the reason why is there's a vested interest. Airline companies don't want their people to die. And if we're looking at the future of this country, we need to look at what is the best option. Do we want we need to look at what can the government do? What can the private sector do? And we need to ask ourselves with it, would the private sector be a negative option here? And if they would be a negative option, because they would be they would be looking for too much of a profit in that thing, and it would cause us a social problem, then let's look for a potential government solution, and because it would cause a social problem in that case. And when we start to look at that, you'll see that it would pretty much eliminate almost every government department, and you'd be down to almost nothing. When we get to the problem of Social Security, obviously we're in a little bit of a situation that people were forced, so we might have to tend to wind that down. and look for options of ways to kind of eventually wind that down. And that would be a way that and that would be the idea of the future, to eventually wind that down and get people off of it, because the fact is it was actually done by theft, stealing people's money and saying you have no choice, and eventually getting people off of it. And that would be the solution. Now this is what we need to be looking toward. And when we look at the solution in the long run for government, it should be eliminating as much as we can, because when people go, oh my God, this guy won the presidency, or this person won in Congress, we should make sure that those elections don't matter. The federal elections should not matter in our actual daily lives. And when we get to that point, that's when we realize that we're successful, that we've done that, and we want to make sure that we can live our daily lives without the federal government actually meaning anything. They should basically have very, very little control, because they should be following the Constitution as written and really just debating very, very minimal things. And that should be the whole point. And what we see now is they're going into areas that the Constitution does not allow. And they've been doing this for a long time. And it's because we go back to, again, the progressive era, where they basically stated that, oh, we can do anything we want, and we can start going over the Constitution any way we want. And the judicial department under the Supreme Court has basically said, okay, we're going to look the other way, because we don't want to get in the middle of anything. And you don't have co-equal branches, because you have the legislature writing unconstitutional laws. You have the judicial branch, which is looking the other way, and you have the executive branch, which is basically usurping the power of both. And you have this huge problem on our hands. And what needs to happen is, if we can get down to a taxation system, we're not even down to a taxation system which is fair, because it's basically devised to basically say, who wants free stuff? That's not what the government's for. The government is for protecting people's liberty. That's it. It has nothing to do with security. Because if we listen to Benjamin Franklin, he said those who would praise security over liberty deserve neither. And the fact is if you want security, we have maximum security prisons in this country. Find a way to get into one, and you have your options right there. Those are the most secure places out there, probably in the world. And let's just say they're not that fun. And that's what you should view in those senses. But you should actually be embracing liberty, and the way to do that is making sure not only do you have personal liberty, but also economic liberty. This means you're not sending your money nor someone else's money and wealth out to the government. The government is evil, and this is what needs to be understood. And it's not going to be anything other than evil. So if you want to basically have a liberty-based system, you're going to have to make sure that they have virtually no ability to change your life. And if you want to basically create a system to where you're not complaining about, oh my God, so-and-so won the election. Well, if you want to stop that, then you need to essentially make sure that when we get to those points that they have no money to actually change anything out there, number one, and number two is that if they're following an actually strict document to where they can neither benefit nor hurt anyone. If they're on that lines, and then you should actually not even care who's in office. It shouldn't matter. And that should be the whole thing. The only things that should matter is who's basically in office in your state, and who's in office locally. Those should be the only questions that really matter, because those are the ones that actually can impact your lives, and that should be the only ones who should be able to impact your lives. The federal government should have very, very minimal impact in your life itself, beyond just upholding liberty. That should be the only job that they have. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure you share this all the way around social media to your friends and everyone else. And make sure you check out my Patreon page. If you can't donate, share it to someone else who can. And that's about it, and I will see you guys later. Bye, everyone.